you know, we had an internal problem because the owned station division, I mean, we owned huge profitable stations, New York, LA, Chicago, Detroit, San Francisco. I mean, they were all making big money. And they saw in this situation an opportunity to make even more money. I mean, their signal would be worth a lot of money to a cable operator. I looked at it from the other point of view, which was, you know, this is not a bottomless well here. I mean, if the cable operator has to start paying for every one of the terrestrial stations they carry, and I mean, that's a huge, huge hit. And that's going to impact the other business. And that's going to impact the other businesses. So, I mean, and it got heated. The meetings that we had, the senior management meetings in which, you know, senior management from the stations division and I and my crowd from the cable operation were at odds. I eventually came up with, and other people also contributed to this, but the idea was, okay, this is all going to wind up badly because they're not going to pay, and we're going to start pulling our signal from cable operators who are not going to pay. That in turn will hurt the viewership of your station. I mean, everybody loses in that kind of a situation. So I said, why don't we instead start a new, I mean, ESPN is doing well. Why don't we start a new cable network? And let's call it ESPN2. And we will ask cable operators to pay for that. Not what they would pay for Channel 7, but a considerable amount of money. And you add up that to all the cable operators. I mean, that's a major new revenue source for ABC. So we come away as a company doing okay. We avoid this disaster hitting the cable industry. And, you know, you guys in the station division continue to get the carriage that you need in order to get your advertising revenue. Oh, boo. But senior management decided that was not a bad idea. It was a way out of this fix we were getting ourselves into. And thus was born ESPN2. And then we started doing some of the other things that we did, going after the Hispanic speaking population. And then we started expanding internationally. But while we were still losing a lot of money on ESPN, I spent a lot of time working in Europe and was starting cable networks in Europe. Formed a partnership in Germany with Herbert Kloiber, who was one of the major media companies, Telemenschen in Germany. And between us, we started several cable networks, RTL2, Super RTL, so forth, all of which are doing really well today. But I was trying to figure out how I could get some money for ESPN out of this whole thing, because we were still losing a lot of money, and every time I'd go before the board, you know, I was getting more and more sheepish about coming and asking for more money.
How long, what was the time period between the time that you had acquired it and when you're still asking for money?
Probably now we're talking 84 maybe, somewhere in there, 83, 84. And since 79, we've been losing money. It was getting bigger all the time until we hit a certain plateau, and then it started to. But we're still losing big money. So we started a sports network in England, UK. And it was doing okay, not great. The French had started a sports network in France or whatever, which was doing okay. So I knew the Canal Plus people real well. And they were part of the partnership of TF1, which was the leading terrestrial network in France, and Canal Plus, which was the pay television operation. And so at one point, I met with the Canal Plus head guy, and I said, you know, we got this thing in England, and you got this thing in France, and why don't we combine forces and expand to the rest of Europe? And let's do a European continental sports network. And just so nobody gets the wrong impression, we'll call it Eurosport. And so the three of us started Eurosport, and the board of directors consisted of me and the head guy from Canal Plus and the head guy in TF1. And most importantly to me was probably 80% of the program that we carried was from ESPN, which they paid for, and which became a major source of revenue for ESPN. So in one way, it was really good for ESPN. But in the long run, it created another problem because, of course, we had to sign a non-compete. And eventually, my thought was we would buy out the other two partners and Eurosport would become the ESPN of Europe, but ESPN would do the programming and so. Well, the major plan was that we would have a European-wide basic network, Eurosport, and then market by market, we would go in and buy the sports rights. Buying sports rights meant football, because there is nothing but football in, I mean, what they call football, we call soccer. And then we superimpose it on this base network that we already have going. And we're spreading the cost of the base network all across Europe. And so all we have to do is recoup the money that we pay in each money for this. Canal Plus thought it was a brilliant idea. The guy from TF1 said, no, not going to do that. And it was, the way we were set up, we were equal partners, and it had to be any major decisions had to be unanimous. And he blocked every attempt we made to do this. So eventually I said, okay, got to buy this guy out. And so I talked to Canal Plus, and I said, you know, we'd like to buy out we'd like to buy you out, we'd like to buy out TF1. Canal Plus said they'd be willing to sell. So I went to the TF1 guy, and I said, you know, we would like to, but he said, we don't want to sell. So I said, okay, outsmarting myself, I said, why don't we do a buy-sell arrangement where we make you an offer, and either you accept the offer or you pay that amount to us for our interest, figuring that they would take them because we're offering big money. They didn't. So they bought Eurosport. That presented us with a problem because, I mean, even though we continued to sell programming from ESPN, that decreased as Eurosport got bigger. They started doing their own stuff and so forth. And we were precluded from competing. So to this day, ESPN is not a major factor in Europe, even though we can go in there. But Eurosport is so well entrenched that it would be expensive and difficult for us to get in. And so we're doing it market by market. We're on Sky Sport in the UK and doing quite well there. And we've taken some of the less costly thing like classic sports, which are really a rerun channel. And we've moved that into some other markets, but we're nowhere in Europe. Otherwise, we are big hitters in places like Latin and South America, Europe, Asia, all of Asia. I remember when we went to India, and the biggest sport there is badminton, and a couple of other sports that are big. Well, we went in and bid. The rights were held by Doordarshan, which is the state-run Indian network, and they were, paying nickels and dimes for it. So we went in and offered quarters and dollars, and we wound up getting the major sports rights in India. And I mean, this was not headlines on the sports pages in Indian newspapers. This was headlines in the front page that this American company has now committed. I mean, it would be like TV Globo coming into the United States and buying the NFL football rights. I mean, it was just unthinkable. But we did it. And we made a lot of money. And everything was wonderful until Rupert started Star Sports. And so when we bid for the rights, we bid $2, he bid $3, and then we bid $4, and then he bid $5. Before you know it, we were both losing our shirts. And Rupert is, I think, a terrific businessman. And we wound up doing a joint venture, which is now called ESPN Star Sports. And we're doing very nicely, thank you, there. And, elsewhere in the world we are huge, except for Europe. And our international business continues to grow considerably.
One of the keystone components of ESPN is Sports Center. Mm-hmm. How did that come about?
Well, what we finally came to the conclusion of it. I mean, it's okay when we bought the NCAA football rights, and it was okay when we bought the National Hockey League, but that was expensive stuff, and we were not making money on it. I mean, that was kind of sowing the seeds. We had to have something we'd make some money on. So we decided we had to become the American authority on televised sports and sports in general. And for that, we needed a sports news program that, if we did it right, would become the definitive voice of sports news. And so we hired a couple of key people, and they were news people from AP, and we said to them, we want a news program. We don't want a lot of flashy pictures and whatever. We do that other places. What we want are hard news. We want scoops. We want to be the sports authority. And thus was born Sports Center. And that we could make a profit on because it was in-house produced. We had access to all of the material that was coming in from Associated Press, and so we had deals with them. And so we became a news organization, a sports news organization. And to this day, that is, Sports Center is the major profit center of ESPN in terms of advertising and so forth, because it doesn't cost much to produce, and it's become the sports authority.
How has the growth of broadband affected ESPN?
Well, again, using my technical background, I said that whenever something new came on the horizon as a distribution system, we had to find a way to get into it early, establish our position as the sports authority, and make as best use of it as we can. And if we have to invest in the early years, we'll do it, because at some point it will begin to pay off for us. So we got into mobile long before anybody else was doing anything in it. And we got into, obviously, all of the internet. I mean, you know, you got an iPhone, you get the ESPN app, and you're in good shape. You know exactly what's going on, when it's going on. It's, you know, they've done a good job of staying on top of each of the new distribution forms as they come in. Occasionally we get a little too deeply into something when we started selling the ESPN phones, whatever. But, you know, you have to throw a lot of stuff out there and hope that some of it starts to take root and grow. And overall, I think they've done a superior job of that. I mean, nobody else that I'm aware of has, you know, come into the internet or the mobile field or whatever, and somebody says, "Oh, well, that, you know, that's better than ESPN." Not happened.
What do you think has been ESPN's impact on the cable industry as a whole?
Well, you know, you talk to cable operators today, and they say, they're dragging us down into non-profitability because they charge so much. But looking at it overall, it was really the single network that made us competitive with the terrestrial networks in terms of offerings and quality. And that was important for the cable industry because, you know, I mean, people were used to watching ABC, CBS, NBC. Well, we need these 500 other things, you know. Pretty soon it became something that you really, if you were a sports nut, you better, you know, have tuned into Sports Center that morning before you went to work, or around the water cooler, you were out of it. So it did have an impact, I think, on the growth and the quality of cable. And we determined really early on that anything that we put on the tube had to be of comparable quality to ABC Sports, where I came from. And Roone, you know, who in the beginning was a little this way and that about ESPN because we were taking away some of the spotlight and so forth, eventually became a huge supporter. In fact, I asked him to be on the ESPN board, and he became a board member of ESPN and was a big help. I mean, you know, his insights were terrific.
And eventually ABC Sports was
yeah, and then it, you know, it got to the point where you know, supporting two separate production companies essentially in the sports business didn't make a lot of sense. And the big money maker was ESPN. And so it was folded in. This was after Roone had moved over to news. So, I mean, if Roone had still been head of ABC Sports, it would have taken a lot longer because he was just such a commanding figure in the sports world. But the fact that he was no longer in the sports world, he was a news guy, and had, you know, established himself when he was still head of sports in Munich during the Munich massacre. I mean, here we are doing an Olympic Games, and all of a sudden the story is not the Olympic Games, it's this invasion by these terrorists who took over the village and eventually assassinated the Israeli wrestling team. And so immediately from being I mean, all sports was suspended, obviously, and so Jim McKay, fortunately, having been a newsman in his early career and so forth, did a yeoman's job of reporting, you know, nonstop, and other ABC sportscasters stepped in, including Cosell, and really gave, they became the eyes of the world on what was happening in the Munich takeover. And that established Rune as a guy who had a real eye for being able to report the news and stay on top of it. I mean, we were the first to be on the air with the massacre and all of those things. So eventually Rune, he loved news, and eventually, as I say, became head of news and sports, and then eventually got so involved in news that he just was head of news. And so without him as the titular head, it just didn't make economic sense to have two production companies. And so ABC Sports essentially came under it became a combined head of ESPN and ABC Sports. And it seems to have worked pretty well.
What do you think is the future of ESPN?
Well, I mean, there are obvious danger signs on the horizon. The ugly matter of retransmission consent is once more a factor of life for the cable operator. He has to pay now for major terrestrial stations. Programming pressures are on him, who, even if he's only paying 12 or 15 or 20 cents to, other cable networks, it adds up when you're talking hundreds of channels. And it's a cost game, and they have other competitors now, the telephone industry, obviously, and internet and distribution of programming over mobile and so forth. So it's not going to be an easy road for them. And yet, I look back to the burial notices for terrestrial networks back in the late 80s and early 90s and through the 90s and into the 2000s, and it's still a pretty darn good business. So I don't see any imminent demise of the cable industry. I just see them having to be, a lot smarter where they spend their dollars, and what they charge for and how they charge for programming. And some of those decisions could have huge impact on the cable programmers. For instance, a la carte programming, which has been pushed on occasion in Washington, could be the death knell of a number of cable programmers, because if a cable operator can pick and choose, he would obviously choose those things that are getting the most viewership. Therefore, I don't see a problem for somebody like ESPN, but some of the more esoteric things, which have loyal audiences and so forth, could drop by the wayside. So it is not a clear path as to how cable will handle that. Fortunately, from my point of view, the whole idea of a la carte appears to be on the back burner now in Washington, and so now we can look for what the next big problem is going to be.
Okay, I'm going to go back a little bit to some things that we skipped over. One of them being your involvement with the Schubert organization and ABC to produce theater.
In theater?
Mm-hmm.
Well, that comes back to, again, I'm always looking for what else can we do, and I've always been a great theater lover. I'm married to an actress whom I met while she was on Broadway, and So at one point in my role as corporate staff member, this was before was it? No, I guess it was after we got into the cable business. I was drunk with power because by then it looked like we were actually going to make some money out of cable. So I had this other idea, and I went to Leonard Goldenson with it. And I said, Leonard, the production costs in Hollywood are going out of sight. I mean, they are rising at a much faster clip than we can raise advertising rates. So, pretty soon that's going to be a real problem for us. So, and a lot of that has to do to these obscene salaries we're paying directors and writers and stars. And so we have to start looking for, the next crop of great directors and writers and even performers. And one of the last bastions of what I would consider to be rational economics in that field is legitimate theater. They're mostly young people writing for the theater, directing for the theater, and so forth. And if we had a way to, kind of be the first guys to identify the next great comedy writer and tie him up contractually, that's worth doing. And so Leonard said, "You're right, because he was appalled by the double-digit increases in production costs." So I said, "So we should get into the theater business." And he said, "Well, how do we do that?" And I said, "Well, we're a 300-pound gorilla in the television business, and I love theater and whatever, but I'm a big enough boy to understand that we are a neophyte in that business. So what we probably should do is find ourselves a partner who is a 300-pound gorilla in the theater business." Picks up the phone, dials a number. "Jerry, I got a young guy I want you to meet. He's got an interesting proposition for you. Lunch today?" "Sure." Bang. I said, "Who is that?" He said, "Jerry Schoenfeld, who is the chairman of the Schubert organization." I said, "Oh." He said, "Go and have lunch with him. Tell him what you want." He said, "Because when you're talking about 300-pound gorillas, that's a 600-pound gorilla. They own most of the theaters." So I went in and met Mr. Schoenfeld, and after the usual perfunctories, I said, "Mr. Schoenfeld, how would you like a 50% partner in your theater business who will put up 50% of the money in anything that you do and would be a silent partner with you making all the decisions because you're the expert in that business and we're not?" He looked at me and he said, "Are you kidding?" I said, "No, we want to be your partner." And at that lunch, we became partners. So at first, we worked out an arrangement and so forth, and I kept out of anything that was going on in terms of what they were investing in new shows and so forth. And at one point, he said, "You ought to come and sit in on one of our pre-production meetings. We're going to bring in this show from London, and we think it's going to be big time, and you can see how we make our decisions." So I thanked him, and I went and I sat in the back of the room and listened. And everything was going fine. I had a couple of ideas, but I kept my mouth shut. And then they got to the marketing of the property. And all of a sudden, I realized that these folks were in the Stone Age when it came to marketing what they were putting on. I mean, their idea of a big promotional campaign was the tombstone ads that they take in the in the Daily Times, and maybe taking a quarter-page ad in the Sunday Times for the new show coming in or whatever. So after a while, I started to speak up and say, did you ever think? And eventually we talked about getting into some radio ads. And I put them in touch with the people who could do that cheaply and whatever. And that seemed to work. And then I said, you know, there was something called local cable advertising, because all the cable networks give the local cable operator about 2 minutes an hour to sell locally. And I said most of them don't do a very good job of it because they're not in that business. They're not in the advertising sales business. So I said, you know, you can buy local cable ads pretty cheaply. And you can buy it adjacent to programming that might have people who would be interested in coming to the theater. So we did some local cable programming. So, and pretty soon, you know, I became part of the production team. And pretty soon, Jerry said, you know, you guys are contributing about as much as anybody else to the thing, so why don't you take a producer's credit? So reluctantly, I said, okay. And but you know, the deal was that I didn't want ABC to get the reputation that we were raping the theater business by grabbing directors and putting them under contract and so forth. And so I said to Jerry, what I would want for our investment was a first negotiation position with writers and directors and so forth. And I also want a last position that they are free then to go into the open marketplace, and if they've got a deal, I reserve the right to top that deal by 10%. So, you know, we're not stealing anything, and that worked out pretty well. I wish I could point to, you know, some magnificent thing that we did that turned out fantastically well in television. Never happened. But, I mean, we got to be known by a whole new crop of creative people. And very often, you know, if they had an idea for a program or something, they'd come to us before they went to somebody else. And some we bought and some we didn't. So it was, you know, normal course of business. And but what we discovered was, in the interim, was that investing in Broadway is not something for the faint of heart, because the program, I mean, the whole idea of Broadway usually boils down to big hits, making good money, and paying for usually more serious drama, which very often doesn't make back the nut. But as long as there is enough money to cover all of the costs, it keeps Broadway healthy. And of course, what most people don't realize is that the Shubert organization is really a non-profit organization. It was set up by the Shubert brothers, and all of the profits, which are considerable, that they make, go into the vitalization of Broadway theater. And I mean, that takes many forms. And so they were, I mean, we were partners for 22 years or so. And I actually got to the point where I would make suggestions, some of which were accepted, some of which weren't. But we began to make money, because what we discovered was that owning the theaters, I mean, there are certain shows that must be in certain theaters or else they won't work. And that particularly holds true for big musicals. And so we were partners in Cats, Phantom of the Opera, Les Mis, Dreamgirls. I mean, these things which make, I mean, how long did Cats run? I mean, you know, years and years and years. Same with Phantom and so forth. But most of that money that we made on those shows, we plowed back into things that we knew would not make a profit, but had to be done to keep the whole Broadway scene viable. Of course, all of that ended when Disney bought ABC. Disney had their own theatrical group, which actually produced a program like The Lion King, etc. They didn't, Michael Eisner, when I went out to see him, looking at him, he said, what is this theater thing that you guys produce? I said, well, yeah, we're partners with the Schuberts, and yeah, we do. And I said, and we make a fair amount of money. And it doesn't cost us anything because I'm the only employee in that unit because, I don't bother anybody else with any of the things. It doesn't take that much time. And so, he said, well, that presents us with a problem because we got this other. So I said, well, what I would suggest is that, we fold it and sell back our 50% interest to the Schuberts. And so we did. And so I had lunch with Jerry Schoenfeld after this had happened. And he said, aren't we going to see you anymore? I said, okay, tell you what. I said, I will become your $1 a year consultant, theater marketing. And Jerry said, why $1? I said, what? He said, why not 50 cents? And thus began a negotiation between $1 and 50 cents. I eventually won the argument because I convinced him that having change in my jacket pocket created a problem for me, and therefore a $1 bill was something that was much more desirable. I mean, I had great fun with that, and they're great people, and I'm a Tony voter.
And that producer credit landed you 2 Tonys yourself.
Yeah, and it was something I enjoyed, and it was worthwhile from the company's point of view because we did get to meet a lot of people talented, creative people that we would not, and we branched out from that. I mean, we became a major contributor to Lincoln Center Theater, nonprofit, and so forth, and we took most of the profits we made from it and invested it in nonprofit theater. So we became good citizens of the theater world, and I think as a result have a good reputation among people who know what's going on Broadway.
You spoke of the Disney-ABC merger. How did that affect you in the corporate offices? What was your title at that point, and where were you in the...
Well, I was, a corporate senior vice president, and I was chairman of all of our cable operations. And when Disney bought it, I had known Michael Eisner. He used to work at ABC when I was young in the business, and he was young in the business. And so, we were reasonable business friends. I mean, we both are skiers, so we used to ski together out in Colorado. And his wife and Anne got to know each other, and occasionally we would get together socially, but we were not great friends. He's in LA and I'm in New York. So when they bought, actually there was a prequel which was pretty funny. As I said, we were very aggressive in getting into foreign investments. After I felt that the cable programming business was pretty well saturated and we didn't have too many places to go there, I started looking at, along with Jack Healy, who was also deeply involved in our European and Asian efforts. We said, well, let's see. There are no commercial stations in Europe, but they are on the horizon and there will be. And when that happens, what's happening now, which is that most of the artsy program that was being done was being licensed from Hollywood. Good series were being licensed all over Europe and Asia. And some of them were being dubbed and some of them were being titled. And it was, it was kind of funny to go to Japan and see, John Wayne speaking in Japanese and so. I mean, that was always fun. But we knew that these commercial licenses were going to be granted. And, we've always, going back to my television days, I was always a believer that local television is more important than national, and national is more important than international, and so on and so forth. So, people are going to start wanting locally produced program rather than dubbed programming out of Hollywood. So I said, why don't we go over to Europe, start in Europe, and let's buy into existing good programming producing companies, because they were there. And so systematically we went in, we didn't start in the UK because that was a different, the BBC is kind of off to one side, that's a whole other thing. So we went to France, and it was a wonderful French producer. I mean, you talk about being French with the beret and the whole 9 yards. Pierre Grimblat. And so he had this really terrific production. He was a great producer. And he had the #1 rated program in France called Navarro, which was kind of a detective thing. It was on TF1, and which by then had gone commercial. The government allowed TF1, which had been owned by the government, to be privately financed. And so there was beginnings of the commercial business. And so he had the #1 show in French television. And so we knew him from having been to, we used to go to MIP and MIPCOM and all of the things. And we were pretty well known because we would sell our programming at those places, the things that we produced at ABC. We had something called ABC Distribution. And anything that we produced, we would take overseas and sell. And so we went to Pierre and we said, Pierre, we would like to buy 50% of your company. And mon Dieu, and here's the deal. You will be in charge of creative. You will run all the productions. We'll take over the business end of your business, which you're not doing very well, and you don't like anyway. And so we'll handle the business end, and you run all the production and do what you love and do well. Wonderful. So he said, well, what are you going to do? I said, well, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to go to TF1, because whether you know it or not, and you probably don't know it, we've looked at your books, and every episode of Navarro you make, you lose money. He said, well, yeah, but we are the #1. I said, that's wonderful, except you lose money. And eventually, that's going to be a problem for you. So what we're going to do is we're going to go to TF1, and we're going to tell them, effective 6 months from today, they will pay double what they are paying now. Mon Dieu, he said, they will throw it off. I said, no, they won't. It's the #1 rated show, and if they do, we go to their competitor, and they will pay us double. Okay. And we did that in France, went into Germany and became partners with Herbert Kloiber. Went into we went into Italy, and one of our partners was a man by the name of Silvio Berlusconi, who ran a very successful television production company. We went into Spain. We went to Holland and became partners with the guy who is now king of the distribution business, and we're his 50% partner. He handling all the production, we handling the business side.
Who retains the rights to the properties?
Well, if it's being produced from scratch, the production company retains the rights. They license it to networks or whomever and so forth. But the underlying rights are held by the production company. And it's the same with the studios. I mean, when they produce something, they retain the rights, and they license different windows and so forth and so on. So there was a guy in Holland by the name of Joop van den Ende, and Joop is a production genius, and so we became his partner. But then he wanted to do something that we considered to be illegal under the Dutch laws, and he had a way around it that he felt was not illegal. But we're very touchy on that subject because I signed every year a foreign corrupt practices document that stated that we were not engaged in anything outside the United States that smelled of illegality, including under-the-table payments. So we were at somewhat of a disadvantage, but we were very conscious of that. And so I said, we can't get involved in that, but we'll stay as your 50% partner in your production side. And he said, no. This is my company. You either are my 50% partner or you are my zero. So we had to say zero. He then went to a man by the name of Jean de Mol, and thus was born Endemol, which is enormously successful today. So all of those things, once the commercial stations became a reality, they were all wonderful investments, and we were making nice money. When Disney bought, and in fact we were doing things by ourselves. We went into China, for instance, and we aligned ourselves with a lady who was extremely well connected. Her father was a general in the Chinese army, a hero of the people, a man who had infiltrated Taiwan as a spy and rose to the level of Assistant Defense Minister of Taiwan, being a spy, and escaped to the mainland just before the roof fell in and they discovered who he was. And so his daughter, was an extremely bright lady, went to school with Mao's daughter, etc., was well connected. And so we started a daily live television show across China called the Panda Club. And it was hosted by this young Chinese gal who became an instant star in China. And I remember getting a call from Michael Eisner one day saying, Panda Club, what the heck is the Panda Club? You were having problem getting Mickey Mouse in there, and you're in with, what's the secret? And jokingly I said, well, why don't you buy ABC and then we'll tell you what the secret is. Anyway, so when they bought ABC, I got a call from Michael and asked if I'd come out and sit down and let's talk about things. And he, he looked at. We were then making money on ESPN and maybe small money on some of the other stuff, and he thought that was fine and we should continue doing that. And he said, "What do you think of what we're doing?" He said, "You get around. What do you think?" I said, "Well, you guys are huge, but." I said, one area that I think you really are lax in is international business. I said, I've done a little investigating, and about 15% of your revenues come from non-U.S. sources. I said, for a company the size of the Walt Disney Company, that's terrible. He said, yeah, we'd like to do some more. He said, you're running around the world doing these things. He said, why don't you take over Disney International? He said, we'll make you chairman of Disney International, and let's see what you can do for us. And so I became chairman of Disney International, and we produced programming, and we sold programming, and we did lots of other things. And then eventually I got to the point where I just wanted to do some other things, and so I said to Michael, okay, I think I've done pretty much what I said I would do for you, and I'd like to move on, come back to just ABC, and I'll stay on as chairman of the cable networks, which I'd continue to do. And I'll take a pay cut, but I'd like to be able to do a couple of things outside of ABC that are non-competitive, but would kind of lead me into the distant horizon. And so he said, fine, whatever you want to do. I mean, Michael was very good to me, and enormously smart guy. So I did, and right away I got a call from a guy who had heard from somebody who heard from somebody that I was able to do some other things, and he asked me to consult with him on German cable, which he had bought. He had bought North Rhine-Westphalia and Baden-Württemberg, which were the two biggest, richest areas of Germany, and he was going to begin cabling those areas, and he wanted me to put together their whole television offering while he concentrated on telephony and high-speed internet and all the good stuff. And, by the way, laying cable. Think about $4 billion later, he went bankrupt. So, but that got me into the consulting business, and then I officially retired from ABC. I picked up some other things, consultancies and board seats and stuff like that there. So I'm now vice chairman of Central European Media, which it's a company headed up by Ronald Lauder. He started the company about 12, 14 years ago, and we own media companies starting with terrestrial television in places like Czech Republic, Romania, Slovakia, Slovenia, Croatia, Bulgaria. If it ends in IA, we're there.
Is it a privately owned company?
It is. Well, no, it's not privately. It's a public company on the NASDAQ. Our two biggest shareholders are Ronald, who holds B shares and therefore has control. And a couple of years ago, Jeff Bewkes decided that this looked like something he might want to do. And so they have become our major shareholder at 35%. And of course, the greeting card company, I got a call from them. And
that's at Crown Media Holdings, right?
This is Crown Media, which owns the channels. And they were not in good shape. They had bought. They came late to the table. They bought out a religious channel. I think it was called Odyssey or something like that. And so I had a head start on at least forming something, but still had a long way to go to become a fully distributed company. And so they're now fully distributed. They're up around 88 million subs, and they're one of the higher rated networks. We bill ourselves as an all-family network. It's one of the few channels around that you can tune in with your kids sitting in the room and not be afraid of what's going to come up on the screen. Do about 28 to 30 made-fors a year. do a bunch of off-network series, squeaky clean. We have access to the Hallmark Hall of Fame, which goes back to the 50s, all beautifully done. I got involved through Peter Lund, who used to be president of CBS television, and called me one day and said, "Hey, this is a good bunch of guys, interesting project, won't take a lot of your time. I'd like to join the board." And so I did. And and then through a series of things, discovered that our primary shareholder, the Hallmark Greeting Card Company, which owned 66 2/3 of the company, the rest being traded on NASDAQ, wanted out. And so when Don Hall, who was the grandson of the founder, came to tell me that he wanted out, I said, well, that means we've got to put the company on the market, because you can't be left with 1/3. So they had a lot of money invested in it, and being a smart businessman, Don wanted his money back. And so we tried to sell the company, could not get, it was widely known, I'm not telling any secrets out of school here. We hired a banker and lawyers and did all the right things, and but could not get the amount of money that Hallmark wanted, rightfully wanted, because they'd invested in it. And so in the long run, I flew out to Kansas City and said to Don, look, ain't going to happen. You got a couple of choices. You can take a haircut, or if you're looking to me for some advice, I would advise you to hang in there. A couple more, 3 to 5 years. Put a little bit more money in, not a lot. Let's redo the management. I'm not particularly happy with the management that you have, and I think they've been not running the company properly. Your costs are way over what they should be. So I think if you hang in and we get things straightened out, eventually you will get your money back and maybe even make profit. So he said, okay, I'll do that on with one caveat. And I said, what's that? And he said, you become my co-chairman. He said, because I don't know anything about the television business. I'm in the greeting card business and a lot of other businesses, but television is not a strong suit, and I don't intend to start learning it at this late stage. So I agreed to be co-chairman and have been for a couple of years now. And we're doing quite well. We started the Hallmark Movie Channel, which is the fastest growing channel. And we use the Hallmark Hall of Fame. Plus we make about 30 made-fors. And of course we license other theatrical releases. And it's doing extremely well. We decided a year or two ago to introduce a women's service sector in the afternoon. Made a deal with Martha Stewart. That's a work in progress. We've added people like Emerald and so forth and so on. And it's a slow process to get that kind of a block of programming established. But it's doing better now this year than it did last year. And what we discovered was that Martha still has great credibility with advertisers, and certain advertisers are willing to pay a considerable premium to be with Martha Stewart. So, you know, as I say, it's a work in progress and going on.
Stop there.